The rain had been coming down for an hour when Elias Barone realized he wasn't going to make it back up the slope on his own. He was 40 yards inside the gate of Holyrood Cemetery in South Philadelphia on his father's grave day, the way he came every October. 34 years old, a coat that cost more than most people on that block cleared in a month, 18 months in a wheelchair, and still the kind of man nobody sat down in front of until he did. But there wasn't a room tonight, no table, no line of men waiting on him to speak first. There was wet gravel, his father's name cut into stone, and a pressure climbing under his ribs that felt like a hand closing slowly around something it had no business touching. His fiancée was already back behind the wheel with the engine running, Margot Ashford, 30 years old, 4 years engaged, and she hadn't stepped out of the car once. He said her name, then he said it again, quieter, because the second time was harder. Please, just stay until I get to the gate. She looked at him through the glass for a moment, not cruelly. That was the part he'd remember. There wasn't anything in her face at all, the way you look at a chair you've already decided not to keep. Call someone who cares, Elias. Then she hit the lock. That small mechanical click carried farther in the rain than anything she'd said to him in 4 years. Her taillights swung out onto Passyunk Avenue and were gone, and the cemetery went back to being what it was, which was quiet and dark and full of people who couldn't help him. He got maybe 6 feet. The wheels sank. The pain went from a pressure to something with edges, and somewhere behind him, back toward Section 12, a single flashlight came on. If stories about dignity, second chances, and the people who show up when nobody else does mean something to you, hit that like button before we start. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And subscribe, because we've got more coming your way. Now let's go back to that rain, and that gate, and the woman walking toward him with the light. The light found him first, a narrow beam swinging low across the wet stones, and then it steadied on his face and stayed there, and for a moment nothing happened at all. The rain kept falling, the beam didn't move. When it finally lowered and he heard footsteps coming fast through the gravel, he noticed that the light was shaking, a small tremor at the edge of the circle it threw on the ground. The kind of shake a hand makes when it isn't cold and isn't afraid, but is doing something it swore it would never do again. She came around the front of the chair and went down on both knees in the mud without hesitating, without asking permission, without any of the careful hovering people had been doing around him for 18 months. She set the flashlight on the ground, pointing up at the two of them so her hands were free. "Look at me," she said. "Don't look past me. Right here." Her fingers went to the side of his throat, 2 of them, pressed flat, and her eyes went somewhere else while she counted, and Elias understood that she was counting, because he'd spent enough time in enough rooms to know what a person's face does when they're counting something that matters. Then she watched his chest. She didn't touch him again for a while. She just watched him breathe, and something in the way she watched made him aware of how shallow he'd let it get, how he'd been taking small sips of air for the last half hour because the full ones cost too much. "When it hurts," she said. "Is it when the air goes in, or when it comes out?" He opened his mouth. What came out was thin and useless. "Margot," he said, because that was the shape his mouth had been making for 20 minutes, because a man's body will keep reaching for a door long after somebody's locked it. She was here. She was right there. Don't tell me anybody's name." She said it flatly, without cruelty, and it landed like a hand on his shoulder. "Names don't help me right now. Tell me where it hurts." He put 2 fingers under his collarbone on the left side. She nodded once, like he'd answered a question she'd already guessed the answer to, and she pulled her phone out of her coat and dialed, and then she started talking, and that was the moment Elias Barone, 40 yards inside the gate of a cemetery he'd come to alone every October since he was a boy, realized the woman kneeling in the mud in front of him wasn't a caretaker who'd stumbled onto something awful. 34-year-old male, conscious, alert, sudden onset pleuritic chest pain, tachypnea, wheelchair user, high suspicion pulmonary embolism, she said. Holyrood Cemetery, Section 12, North Gravel Path. The main gate's chained. Tell them to come around to the service entrance off the alley, and I'll have it open. She listened. "No, I'm not leaving him." She listened again. "Then send them anyway." She hung up. She was already shrugging out of her coat before the phone was back in her pocket, and she laid it across his chest and tucked the edges down against his sides, the way you'd do for somebody you'd known a long time. "That's for the shaking," she said. "It isn't the cold. Your body's just running out of places to put it. You've done this before." His voice came out in pieces. She didn't answer that. She moved around behind him instead, got one hand flat against the back of his head, and turned it slightly, tilting him so his chin came off his chest, and the air had a straighter road to travel. Then she stayed there, crouched, one knee down in the gravel, holding his head steady with the same steady pressure a person uses on a door they don't want the wind to take. The rain ran off the ends of her hair. Somewhere out on Passyunk Avenue a siren started up, still far away, still no promise of anything. "How long has it been hurting?" she asked. "Since this afternoon, and you came anyway. It's the day I come." She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "I've seen you." He tried to turn his head to look at her, and she wouldn't let him, and he let it go, and for a while there was nothing but the rain and the two of them, and the small yellow circle the flashlight threw up into all that dark. Dr. Helen Marsh had been working the night side at Mercy General long enough to know that the quiet ones were the dangerous ones, and the man they brought in off the cemetery service road was very quiet. She read the scan before she read the chart. A clot had formed somewhere in the deep veins of his leg, the way clots do in a body that spends its days at rest, and it had broken loose and traveled up through the heart and lodged in the pulmonary artery, and now a portion of his lung was doing the work of breathing without any blood arriving to collect the payment. "It's the thing nobody warns you about," she thought, watching the anticoagulant begin its slow argument with his blood. People warn a man about his heart. They warn him about his weight and his salt and his temper. Nobody sits him down and tells him that the real risk of a life lived sitting still is a small, quiet traveler that takes 18 months to pack and then leaves without a word. She'd have told him he was maybe 40 minutes from the other outcome, if he'd asked. He didn't ask. He surfaced sometime after 2 in the morning to the sound of a machine keeping count of him, and the first thing his eyes found wasn't the ceiling or the window or the line running into the back of his hand. It was a wool glove sitting on the tray table beside the bed, dark green, soaked through, one finger stiff with mud where it had been pressed into gravel. Nobody had claimed it. Nobody had thrown it away, either. It just sat there in the middle of all that white, holding the shape of a hand that wasn't in it. A nurse came in with a clipboard and asked him to confirm the person listed as his emergency contact, and he said the name because it was the name that had been on that line for 4 years, and she stepped into the hall and dialed it. The call log would show it later, and it would show it plainly, the way call logs do, without adjective or excuse. The line connected. It stayed connected for 6 seconds, then it ended. Across the river and 11 floors up, in a room with warm light and cold champagne, Sterling Vaughn was putting his glass down so he could use both hands. "There's a version of this city," he was saying, "that everybody in this room has tried to buy at one point or another, and everybody in this room has been told no." Laughter. The low appreciative kind that money makes. 22 acres on the water. Zoned, tangled, sitting there for 2 generations while the rest of us built around it like it was a rock in a field. He put a hand out toward her. "Margot has spent 18 months learning every door on that parcel. She found the one that opens." Margot Ashford stepped forward into the light and did what she always did, which was to be slightly better than the introduction, and she thanked the room and named 3 people who deserved credit more than she did, and she was aware, the entire time, of Vaughn's hand settling low against her back. It rested there. It stayed. She did not step away from it, and the not stepping away was so small a thing that no one in the room would have called it anything, and she would spend a considerable part of the next year trying to explain to herself why she remembered it as the largest thing she did that night. Behind her, filling the wall, the rendering rotated slowly. Glass towers standing in a soft computer-generated dusk. A promenade, water taxis, little digital people walking little digital dogs. And where Holyrood Cemetery had been sitting since before anybody in that room had a grandfather, there was a plaza. A circular plaza, pale stone, benches arranged in a pleasant curve, and at the center of it a fountain lit from below in that particular shade of blue that developers use when they want a place to look like it has always been there. Her phone lit once against the tablecloth, a hospital extension. She turned it face down, because the man from the financing group had started talking, and you do not interrupt a man from a financing group, and she promised herself she'd step out in 10 minutes. She stepped out in 4 hours. None of that mattered, though, to the thing that had already begun. At 11 minutes past 9 that evening, while Elias Barone was being lifted through the service entrance and Margot Ashford was choosing which of 2 earrings to wear, a compliance server in the basement of the Orphans' Court in Philadelphia finished its nightly pass through newly filed petitions and stopped on a document. It had no opinion about any of them. It simply compared what a file said about itself to what the file actually was. A letter had been submitted in support of the Kestrel Harbor petition, described in the index as a current statement of intent from a party of interest. The document's own metadata disagreed. Its creation date was old, older than anyone had claimed. Its page count had changed. It had been opened, altered, and saved from an account that had nothing to do with the man whose signature sat at the bottom of it. The server flagged it, generated a case reference, and went on to the next file. A clerk read the flag the following morning with a cup of coffee going cold beside her, read it twice, and walked it upstairs. By noon, Judge Ruth Ballinger had signed an order setting an emergency hearing on the authenticity of the submitted materials and the validity of the consents attached to them, and notices went out to every party of record. The clock started there. It started without Elias, who was asleep in a bed in Mercy General with a stranger's glove on the table beside him, and it started without Clara, who was walking a wet gravel path at dawn looking for a flashlight she'd left in the mud, and neither of them would know for 2 more days that it was already running. He signed himself out 2 days early, against advice, on a form that used the phrase at his own risk 3 separate times, and he left with a paper bag from the hospital pharmacy holding a month of anticoagulants and a printed sheet of instructions he folded once and put in his coat without reading. Dr. Marsh told him what happens to people who do this. He thanked her for her time. The car took him across the city to the old brick building in Fishtown that had been a printing house before it was anything else, and the men who worked in it had learned a long time ago to be in the lobby when he arrived, rather than to be seen hurrying toward it, and so they were. Warren Pike met him at the elevator with a folder under his arm and didn't say anything about the hospital, because Warren Pike had spent 4 decades learning which silences were worth more than sympathy. Upstairs, the conference room held 11 men who ran things. Construction, freight, 2 funds, a title company, a bonding agency. Elias came in and took his place at the head of the table and set the paper bag from the pharmacy down in front of him where everyone could see it, which was not an accident, and then he folded his hands and asked his first question. Who's carrying Delano Brothers' payroll this month? A man named Farrow said the bank was on a revolving line and had been since spring. Their people haven't been paid since the 2nd week of September, Elias said. The men on the Aramingo job. 4 weeks. Is that right? Farrow said he'd heard something. You heard something. Elias didn't raise his voice. He hadn't raised his voice in a room like this in 11 years, and had found that the not raising of it did more work than the raising ever had. Call Bregman at the bank. Not his office. Him. Tell him I'd like to understand how a revolving line gets extended to a company that isn't meeting payroll, and tell him I'd like to understand it before the end of the day, because tomorrow I'll have to ask someone else and I'd rather not. Farrow left the room. He was gone 6 minutes. When he came back, he sat down without being asked and said the line had been suspended pending review, and nobody at the table looked at him, which was its own kind of looking. Second question. Where is Councilman Reyes on the riverfront zoning vote? Somebody said he was leaning yes and had been leaning yes since the summer. He has a brother-in-law who bids on demolition work, Elias said. 3 of those bids went through a company that's carried on our paper. I don't want the councilman touched, I don't want him called, and I don't want anybody in this room within a mile of him. I want somebody to send his office a copy of the bonding schedule with a note asking whether he'd like it corrected before it becomes part of the public record. That's all. Send it politely. At 4:40 that afternoon, the councilman's chief of staff notified the committee that a scheduling conflict would prevent his attendance at the vote, and asked that his seat be recorded as absent rather than abstaining, which is a distinction that matters to precisely one kind of person, and Reyes was that kind. Third question, and Elias asked it looking at the window rather than at any of them. Has anyone at this table spoken to Kestrel Harbor? The room went a particular flavor of still. Nobody had, or nobody said they had. He nodded once as though that settled something, and moved on, and later Warren would tell him that the pause before that answer had been the most useful thing purchased all afternoon. Between the second question and the third, a call came up from the lobby. Gerald Ahn, who ran the Port Authority and had never in his professional life driven himself anywhere, had parked his own car on Frankfurt Avenue and come in through the front door without an appointment. He was told Mr. Barone was in a meeting. He said he'd wait. He waited an hour and 10 minutes on a bench in a lobby with no receptionist, and nobody offered him a chair in a better room, and nobody offered him coffee, and when he finally left he asked the man at the desk to please let Mr. Barone know he'd stopped by, and the man at the desk wrote it on a slip of paper and said he would. That was the whole of it, 19 minutes of talking, spread across an afternoon, and by the time the light went orange over the rooftops a bank had closed a door, a councilman had discovered a conflict, and a man who ran a port had learned where he stood by the temperature of a bench. Warren waited until the room emptied. "Your father would have needed a month for that," he said. "He'd have had to sit down with all three of them, two of them twice." "My father had to walk into rooms," Elias said. "I just have to pick up a phone." He said it evenly, with no particular pride, and Warren didn't answer, because he'd known Salvatore Barone for 30 of those 40 years, and he knew that the son had just described, without meaning to, the exact shape of what the wheelchair had taken, and the exact shape of what it had given back. Then Elias put his hands on the wheels and turned toward the door, and 11 men who between them controlled more of the waterfront than the city did, stood where they were and let him go first, and not one of them moved until the sound of him was gone from the hallway. It wasn't respect, exactly. Respect is something men give. This was something else, something they had no say in, and Elias felt it settle over his shoulders the way it always did, heavy and familiar, and worth precisely nothing at 40 yards inside a cemetery gate in the rain. Warren followed him into the office at the end of the hall and shut the door, and he didn't sit down, which told Elias everything about what was coming. He set the folder on the desk and opened it to a plat map, the kind that gets drawn once every 50 years and then copied and copied, until the copies are what everyone argues about. "You should look at this before anybody else tells you what's in it," he said. The riverfront ran along the top of the page in pale blue, below it the parcels, and running through the middle of all of them in a heavy black line, an easement. "Your grandfather bought the right-of-way when the freight spur went in," Warren said. "Your father consolidated it into the trust in '94, along with everything else. It runs the length of that waterfront. Access, drainage, utilities, egress. Nobody digs a hole on that river without crossing it." He touched a small, irregular shape at the eastern edge, wedged between two larger parcels like a tooth that had refused to come out. "That's Holyrood, 22 acres of somebody else's problem, and the only legal way onto it runs through the trust, which means there isn't a development, a demolition, a relocation, a shovel, or a survey stake anywhere on that ground without a signature from the controlling trustee." He let that sit. "That's you. It's been you since your father died. It'll be you until you decide otherwise." Elias looked at the map for a while without touching it. "Say the rest," he said. Warren took a second folder out from under the first, thinner, and this one he did not open. "The prenuptial agreement," he said. "Executed 4 years ago in my office with her attorney present, which I want on the record because it matters later. Schedule C is attached to it. 6 pages. It identifies the trust, it identifies the assets held by the trust, it identifies the easement by parcel number, and it identifies you as beneficial controller." She had it for 11 days before she signed it. Her attorney read it. She initialed every page. He set it down. I watched her do it. She initialed the last page, and she said something to me that I've thought about a great deal since. She said, "I don't need to know what's in the vault. I just need to know it's his and not mine." Elias didn't move. "She wasn't hiding anything when she said it," Warren said. "That's what I want you to understand. She wasn't lying to me, and she wasn't lying to herself. She simply decided that particular door wasn't interesting, and she never went back to it, and 4 years is a long time for a door to stay closed once you've decided that." Outside, a truck went past on Frankfurt Avenue, and the window took the sound and gave it back thinner. "Now the part I've been carrying," Warren said. Elias looked up. Kestrel Harbor filed a petition in Orphans Court. It's been building since the summer. Consents, surveys, a relocation plan. There's a submission in it that has your father's name on it. Something moved through Elias's face, and then stopped, held, the way water stops at a lock. How long have you known? Since June. Since June, Warren said. And I didn't bring it to you, and I want you to hear the reason from me instead of from a courtroom. He put both hands on the back of the chair he still hadn't sat in. 18 months ago, when you came home from the hospital the first time, you gave me an instruction. You said that anything crossing my desk with the name Ashford on it, in any capacity, on any letterhead, was to be handled by counsel and was not to be brought to you. You said you weren't going to spend the rest of your marriage reading her mail. He paused. You gave me that instruction in your kitchen. You were in a great deal of pain. I wrote it down anyway, because I write everything down, and I have honored it since the day you gave it to me. Warren, let me finish. His voice didn't rise. It got quieter, which in Warren Pike was the same thing. I have worked for this family for 40 years. I buried your father. I've told 3 generations of Barone men things they didn't want to hear, in this room, standing exactly where I'm standing. I have never once regretted following an instruction from any of them. He looked at the folder on the desk. This is the first time. The clock on the wall did what clocks do. Elias sat with his hands flat on the arms of the chair and looked at the plat map, at the little irregular tooth of ground with his mother and father in it, and he thought about the 11 days a woman had held 6 pages in her apartment and not opened them, and he thought about a man in a kitchen 18 months ago saying, with what he genuinely believed at the time was generosity, "Don't bring me anything with her name on it." He had thought he was protecting the marriage. He understood now, with the clarity that arrives about 2 hours too late for everything, that he had simply built himself a room with one window and then complained about the view. "How bad is it?" he said. "I'd rather show you than tell you," Warren said. "Tomorrow. You'll want to be sitting down for it. And I'd like Dr. Marsh's pills to have had a night's head start." Clara Dunn climbed the 3 flights to her apartment that evening, with the mail under her arm and her boots still holding the shape of the week. And she did what she always did, which was to drop the whole stack on the kitchen counter and not look at it until she'd eaten something. The apartment was one long room with a slope in the floor and a radiator that clanked like somebody was living inside it. On the refrigerator door there was a photograph held up by a magnet from a pizza place that had closed years ago, a young man in a work jacket squinting into the sun with his arm around her shoulders, and she'd stopped seeing it the way you stop seeing a wall. She ate standing up. Then she took the mail to the floor, because the one chair had a broken leg and she'd never gotten around to it, and she went through it the way people go through mail when none of it is going to be good. The hospital first. It always came first because she'd trained herself to get it over with. The billing statement for Maeve Dunn, deceased, account still active, still accruing, a number at the bottom that had gone down by about the price of a used car in 4 years of payments, and had another decade in it at the rate she was going. She set it aside without flinching. Then a utility bill, then something from a dental clinic that wanted her to think about her smile, then a folded circular for a supermarket, and then 2 envelopes on heavy cream paper with a logo she'd been seeing on trucks and fence banners all over the riverfront since spring. Kestrel Harbor Partners. She opened the first one because she assumed it was the same notice they'd sent to the cemetery office 3 times, the one about the survey. It wasn't. "Dear Miss Dunn," it began, and it thanked her. It thanked her sincerely and warmly for her consent to the relocation of interred remains from Holyrood Cemetery, Section 12, and it assured her that the transfer would be conducted with the utmost dignity and in full accordance with all applicable law, and it said her family's cooperation was helping to build something the whole city would be proud of. At the bottom of the second page was a reproduction of the consent form, and at the bottom of that was a signature, and the signature said, "Maeve Dunn." Clara read it. Then she read it again, the way you check a step you've already put your foot through. She opened the second envelope. The same letter, word for word, the same warm assurance about dignity and law, and at the bottom of it, in the same hand, in the same forward-leaning script with the same small flourish coming off the final letter, Daniel Dunn. She sat there on the floor of a 3rd-floor apartment in South Philadelphia, with a letter in each hand, and looked back and forth between them. Her mother had signed her name the way she did everything else in the last years, slowly, with the pen held in a fist because the fingers wouldn't cooperate, so that the letters came out large and square and separate from each other, like a child's, and Clara had watched her do it on 100 forms and had never once been able to look away. Danny had signed his name like he was late for something. 2 humps and a line. He'd been proud of it. He'd practiced it on the back of an envelope when he got his first paycheck and made her look. Neither of those hands had written anything on the papers she was holding. What was on those papers was a stranger's hand doing an impression of a family, and doing it twice, and doing it well enough that somebody in an office somewhere had scanned it and filed it and moved on to the next one. A sound came out of her that she didn't recognize. It was a laugh. That was the strange part, that it came out as a laugh, one short, flat bark of it, because the absurdity got there before anything else did, because for one full second, the only thought in her head was that somebody had gone to the trouble of forging her mother's permission to be dug up, and her mother had been in the ground for 4 years and would have had a great deal to say about the handwriting. Then the second came, and the laugh was gone, and what replaced it went through her so hard that she had to put both letters down on the floorboards to keep from folding them. She didn't cry the way people cry in front of other people. She cried the way you cry when you're alone in a room with a broken chair, with her hand over her mouth and her eyes open, looking at the refrigerator door. When it passed, she got up, and she found a plastic grocery bag under the sink, and she put both letters in it flat and unfolded, and she put the bag inside a cereal box on the top shelf. Because some part of her that had once worked a job where evidence mattered knew before the rest of her did that these were not letters anymore. Then she got her coat, and it wasn't until she had her hand on the door that she remembered the coat was still hanging in a hospital somewhere, and she stood there for a moment in the doorway of her own apartment, and then she went back for the other one. He came back on a Thursday, in the middle of the afternoon, with the paper bag of pills in his coat pocket, and a driver who was told to wait at the gate. The chain was off. The gravel had dried into ruts, and his wheels found every one of them, and he was most of the way down the north path before he saw her, out in Section 12 with a pair of hedge shears, working the edge along a row of stones the slow way, because the machine had been broken since August. She straightened up when she heard him. She didn't do any of the things people do. She didn't put a hand to her chest or say his name like a question, or come hurrying over with that bright, startled face that means a person is deciding how to behave. She just set the shears down against a headstone and looked at him for a second, and then walked over the way you'd walk over to somebody who'd said he might stop by. "You're upright," she said. "More or less. Doctor let you out?" "Not exactly. No," she said. "I didn't think so." She pulled off her work gloves and folded them into her back pocket, and there was a silence, and he found that he'd come all the way across the city with nothing prepared, which hadn't happened to him in years. "I owe you a coat," he said. "You owe me a glove," she said. The coat came back. Somebody at Mercy sent it over in a bag with a note on it. "The glove I've been looking for since Tuesday morning, green one, left hand." He thought about the tray table beside the bed, the dark green wool holding the shape of a hand. "I have it," he said. "You've been keeping it. It's on my kitchen counter." She looked at him for a moment longer than the sentence needed. "All right," she said. "Then that's settled." "It isn't." He put his hands flat on the wheels. "There's a thing that happens to people in my position. Somebody does something for you, and you send a car around with something in it, and everybody understands what's being said, which is thank you, and also we're finished now." He watched a truck go by out past the fence. "I don't want to do that, but I've forgotten how to do the other thing." Clara considered him. Then she picked her gloves back out of her pocket. "Come on then," she said. "You can look at something." She walked, and he rolled, and she went slow without making a performance of going slow, and she took him along the packed dirt track, where the wheels would hold, rather than the gravel where they wouldn't, and she did it without mentioning that she was doing it. They went past the good stones, the family plots with the granite and the Italian names and the little photographs set in porcelain, and then past the older section where the markers went thin and gray and started leaning, and then out to the far edge along the fence line where the grass got rougher and the mowing stopped being anybody's priority. She stopped there. "Look down," she said. 9 rectangles in the ground. No granite. No names. 9 flat metal markers about the size of a paperback, set level with the dirt, each one stamped with a number and nothing else. They were in a straight line, evenly spaced, and the grass between them had grown over the edges the way grass does when nobody comes with clippers. "That's it," Clara said. "That's the whole record above ground. 9 numbers." Elias sat looking at them. "Who are they?" "That's what I wanted to show you." She'd brought something with her from the shed, tucked under her arm, and now she crouched and opened it across her knees. A ledger, cloth-bound, the interment book for the years before anything got put in a computer, pages soft as cloth from being turned. She found the place with her thumb. 9 burials, she said. Same week, March, a long time back. 9 men, and I've gone through the parish records and the county index, and there's nothing on any of them except a name and a date, and 2 of the names are spelled 2 different ways depending on which page you're on. She turned the book so he could see it. But look at the payment column. He looked. 9 lines, 9 entries, and beside each one, in the column where the funeral homes and the insurance companies and the county indigent fund were supposed to go, the same 3 words repeated down the page. Paid in full, cash, and beside that, the same date on all 9, one single date, one afternoon, somebody walking into a cemetery office with an envelope and settling 9 accounts at once and walking back out. Somebody paid for all of them, Clara said. Same day, same money, no name on the receipt. The office wrote it in by hand. She looked up at him. I've been here 3 years, and that's the only page in this book like it. Whoever that was, he didn't want anybody to know he'd done it, and he wanted it done anyway. She closed the ledger halfway, then stopped, and looked out at the row of numbers in the grass. This is what I think about, she said. There's a plaza on a screen somewhere with a fountain in it, and it sits right about where we're standing, and the people who drew it up counted the stones, because stones are what you count. Nobody counts 9 pieces of stamped metal in the weeds. She shook her head slowly. People treat the dead exactly the way they treated the poor when they were alive. Nothing changes. It just gets quieter. Elias hadn't answered. He'd put out his hand for the ledger and she'd given it to him, and he'd opened it flat across his lap and turned it toward the light, and he wasn't reading the numbers anymore. He was reading the handwriting, the narrow forward slant, the way the letter F came down below the line with a hook on it, the way it always had, on Christmas cards and on the backs of photographs, and on a note left on a kitchen table for a boy who'd wake up before anybody else in the house. The clerk hadn't written those entries. Someone had handed the book across the counter and written them himself. 9 lines, one afternoon, in his own hand, and then closed the book and gone home. Elias sat in the wet grass at the fence line of Holyrood with his father's handwriting open across his knees, and did not say a single word. Warren had 2 things laid out on the long table when Elias came in that evening, and he'd put them side by side rather than one on top of the other, which was itself an argument. On the left, 3 pages, the paper gone the color of weak tea, a letterhead with an address on Delaware Avenue that hadn't existed in 20 years. On the right, 1 page, crisp, scanned and reprinted, bearing the case stamp of the Orphans' Court. Read the one on the left first, Warren said. Take your time, you'll want the whole thing. Elias read it. It was his father's voice, which was a strange thing to encounter without warning. The plain, flat sentences of a man who'd learned to write from other men's letters. Salvatore Barone was writing in support of a redevelopment study for the eastern riverfront. He wrote that the docks had been dying since before his own father died, and that a neighborhood cannot live on what it used to be. He wrote that he would put his name and his money behind any honest plan that put working people back on that water. And then, on the second page, in the middle of a paragraph, without any special emphasis, he had written 2 sentences that had cost him nothing at the time, and were now worth more than the entire waterfront. Nothing in this letter is to be read as support for any action touching consecrated ground. The cemetery at Holyrood is not to be moved, and I will oppose any man who tries it, in public and by name. The 3rd page had the date and the signature. Elias set it down and picked up the one on the right. It was the same letter, the same letterhead, the same opening line about the docks dying, the same promise of name and money behind an honest plan. It ran to a single page and ended cleanly at the bottom with the signature block reproduced beneath it. There was no date anywhere on it. The 2 sentences were gone, not blacked out, not marked as an excerpt, gone, and the paragraph closed up smoothly around the hole where they'd been, so that a person reading it would feel nothing missing at all. Under it, in the court index, it was described as a current statement of intent from a party of interest. Elias read it 3 times, then he sat back. They're using him, he said. They're using his own words to open his own grave. That's the shape of it, yes. How did they get the original? They didn't. They got a copy. Your father sent that letter to 9 or 10 people. It went into a file at the Planning Commission, and it's been sitting in a public archive for 20 years where anybody with a library card could pull it. Warren tapped the crisp page. Which is what makes this worse rather than better. They didn't steal it. They found it lying in the open, and then they took 2 sentences out of it, and then they filed the remainder under oath as a description of a dead man's present intentions. He set a 3rd document down. This is the approval log. Elias looked at it. A file name, a timestamp for when the document was opened, a timestamp for when the certification was executed, and between the two, less than a minute. The name on the certification was Margot Ashford, Executive Vice President, Development. He looked at the gap between the 2 times for a long while, longer than he'd looked at the letter, and Warren let him. 51 seconds. Not enough to read a page, barely enough to scroll to the bottom of one. She had not written the lie. She had opened the door it walked through and had been thinking about something else while it passed. There's one call, Warren said carefully, that ends this tonight. You know what it is. Trustee invokes the easement. The petition has no access to plead. The whole filing collapses before the courthouse opens tomorrow, and Kestrel spends the next 4 years explaining it to their financing partners. He waited. You could make it from this room. It would take you 90 seconds. Elias put the 2 versions of his father's letter back down on the table, the 3 pages and the 1 page, and squared their edges with the flat of his hand. Get me the audit chair, he said. Warren's eyebrows went up perhaps a 1/16 of an inch. Say that again? Get me the audit chair, and then get me the court, and I want it in writing before midnight. He looked up. I'm disclosing the conflict. My fiancé is a certifying officer on the petition. That goes on the record tonight. In my words, before anybody else puts it there in theirs. And I'm recusing. Every decision touching Kestrel Harbor goes to the independent panel. No vote from me, no opinion, no phone calls to anybody who sits on it. Elias. They'll say I bought the outcome. Whatever happens, whatever they find, they'll say the man who owns the road bought it. So I don't touch it. Warren was quiet. Then he pulled out a chair, finally, and sat down in it, and took a small hardbound notebook out of his inside pocket and set it on the table between them where it could be seen. Then let me draw the line for you, because you'll walk over it by Friday if I don't, he said. You're recusing from the vote. You are not recusing from your own defense. A man is allowed to find out who forged his father, but from tonight, everything you touch, I write down. Who you meet, what you ask, what you're told, date and hour, in this book, in my hand. He put 2 fingers on the cover. And if there's ever something you're planning to do that you wouldn't want written in here, then don't do it. That's the whole test. It's a simple one, and it has never once been wrong. Elias looked at the notebook for a moment. My father used to say the strongest man in the room is the one who never has to show anybody the knife, he said. He was lying. I knew he was lying when I was 9 years old, and I've known it every year since. He turned toward the window, where the last of the light was going off the rooftops. But I'd like it to be true. Once. Before I die, I'd like it to be true one time. Warren uncapped his pen, wrote the date at the top of a clean page, and underneath it wrote the first line. The invitation came the morning after the disclosure hit the docket, which told Elias everything he needed to know about how it had been read on the other side of the river. Sterling Vaughn's assistant called Warren's office and used the phrase "a conversation between grown men," and Warren wrote the phrase down in the notebook along with the date and the hour, and then he asked Elias whether he intended to go. Elias said he did. Warren asked whether he wanted him there. Elias said no, and then, after a moment, said write that down too. The restaurant was on Passyunk, an old room with pressed tin overhead, and a tile floor worn pale in a path from the door to the kitchen. The kind of place where the menu had been the same since the Carter administration, and nobody had ever once asked it to change. Vaughn arrived at 7 and stopped 3 steps inside. There was nobody in it, not a single table taken, not a couple at the bar, not a man eating alone by the window. The chairs were down and the candles were lit, and every one of those tables was empty, and at the far end, at a 2-top near the back, Elias Barone sat with his hands folded, waiting. Vaughn crossed the room slowly, the way a man does when he's recalculating with every step. You bought out the floor, he said. The whole night. Elias gestured at the chair. Sit down. Vaughn sat. That's a hell of a thing to do to a Tuesday. I buy quiet, Elias said. It's about all that's left worth buying. Everything else I own I inherited or I don't want. He raised 2 fingers, and the one waiter in the building came, and Elias ordered for both of them without asking, the veal for himself and the branzino for Vaughn, and a bottle of red he didn't intend to drink. And when the waiter had gone, the room settled back into a silence so complete you could hear the traffic on the avenue through the glass. Vaughn started talking. He talked for a while about how these things get away from people, about how a project of this size has 40 hands on it, and how nobody can be responsible for every page, about the unfortunate mechanics of a compliance flag, and how the court was reacting to a clerical mismatch as if it were a crime. He said the word regrettable twice. Elias let him get all the way to the end of it. Then he said, Your operating account at Fulton stands at a little over $900,000. Your reserve account, the one under the holding entity, has been drawn down twice since June, and it's carrying less than the payroll it's supposed to guarantee. 6 weeks ago, you personally signed a bridge loan against the Kestrel pledge, at 4 points over prime, with a call provision that triggers if the riverfront petition stalls in any court for more than 90 days. He said it evenly, the way a man reads back a phone number. And on the 18th of last month, in a closed session your board did not minute. The vote to continue funding the acquisition went 5-4. You were the 5th. Vaughn had gone very still. The waiter came with the wine, and neither of them looked at him, and he set it down and left. Now I want you to hear the next part correctly, Elias said, because it's the only part that matters. I'm not telling you any of that to frighten you. If I wanted you frightened, I'd have set it to a room instead of a table. I'm telling you because I've had all of it for the better part of a year, and in that year I've never once used it, and you slept fine every night of it. He turned the stem of his glass a quarter turn and left it where it was. You looked at a man who doesn't stand up, and you decided that what you were seeing was a man who couldn't reach you. People do that. It's the most common mistake there is, and it's expensive, and almost nobody gets told about it in time to fix it. Vaughn tried to find his footing, and what he found instead was the thing that men reach for when the ground is gone. He leaned back and let a smile onto his face and said, You're in a wheelchair, Barone. Elias looked at him. I am, he said, which means I've had a good deal more time to sit and think than you have. The food came. It was set down in front of both of them, and it steamed, and neither man picked up a fork, and it went on steaming, and then it stopped. Here's what happens now, Elias said. I've recused myself. Every decision about your petition goes to a panel I don't sit on and won't speak to. You'll hear people tell you I bought the outcome. I didn't. And when they look, they'll find that I didn't, and you should understand what that means for you. He let that sit for a moment. It means there's no one to negotiate with. Not me. Not anyone I can reach. Whatever's in that filing is going to be read by people who have no reason on this earth to be kind to either of us. If there's something in it you'd like to withdraw, tomorrow morning is the last day it costs you anything less than everything. And if I don't, then you don't. Elias put his hands on the wheels. I'm not the one you should be worried about, Mr. Vaughn. I want that on the record between us. I stepped back so that whatever comes for you can't be blamed on me. He turned the chair. He took an envelope from his coat, and he put it on the table and slid it under the edge of Vaughn's untouched plate, and Vaughn's eyes went to it fast and stayed. For the floor, Elias said. The owner's 81, and he took a loss on a Tuesday to do me a favor. He shouldn't have to. Then he crossed that long empty room, past every set table, and went out into the noise on Passyunk Avenue, and Sterling Vaughn sat alone at the back of a restaurant he'd walked into, as the man with the leverage, with 2 plates of cooling food and a bottle nobody had poured. She came into Warren Pike's office on a Monday morning in her work boots with a cereal box under her arm, and the receptionist tried to take a message, and Clara said she'd wait, and she waited 2 hours and 40 minutes on a bench by the window without once asking how much longer. When Warren finally came out and saw the box, he almost smiled. Upstairs, she set it on his desk and took out a plastic grocery bag, and out of the bag 2 letters on heavy cream paper, and she laid them flat, side by side, facing him. That's my mother, she said, touching the first. And that's my brother. She sat down. My mother's been gone 4 years. Somebody signed her name to a permission slip to have her taken out of the ground, and then somebody else scanned it, and then somebody else filed it in a courthouse. And not one of those people stopped. Warren put his glasses on. He read them both twice, the way he read everything, and then he stood up and went to the cabinet behind him and came back with a bound copy of the petition, and he opened it to the consent schedule and turned it around. "Look at what they claim," he said. Kestrel Harbor had certified a consent rate of 94% among identifiable next of kin. It was an impressive number. It was the number in the press release and the number in the financing summary, and the number the councilman's office had quoted before the councilman discovered his conflict. Underneath it, in a table nobody was ever meant to open, was how they'd arrived at it. 211 records had been removed from the denominator. The reason code beside every one of them was the same, unable to locate. They didn't get 94%, Warren said. They got 94% of what was left after they threw away everyone who was inconvenient to find. Clara reached over and turned the page toward herself and started reading the names, and about a third of the way down the first column she stopped and put her finger on the paper and looked up. "Petrosky," she said. "Anna Petrosky comes the first Sunday of every month. She's 86. Her son drives her. She brings a folding chair and she stays about an hour, and she signs the visitor's book at the shed every single time because she likes the pen." She went further down. "Kowalczyk Ruiz. That's a family of 11. They come at Easter and they take up the whole path. Further, Bianchi comes twice a year. Doyle comes on his father's birthday, and he always leaves a pack of cigarettes on the stone, and I always take it off after he goes." She sat back. "I have their names in my hand every month. I have had them in my hand for 3 years, unable to locate." "Where is that book kept?" Warren asked. "In the shed. It's a book. It's got a pen on a string." Warren wrote something in the small hardbound notebook at his elbow. "Miss Dunn," he said, "I'd like you to bring me every visitor's book you have. Do not photocopy them. Do not tell anyone at the cemetery office you're bringing them." Then he took the 2 cream letters and held them up to the window light, side by side, close together, and looked at the 2 signatures for a long moment. "And these were written by the same hand," he said. "Look at the way the ink stops. There are 30 or 40 like it in the file." Whoever did this got tired around the middle and started rushing. 3 days later, Clara was suspended. The letter came from the Holyrood Board of Managers and cited unauthorized disclosure of interment records and family information, effective immediately, pending review, and it required the return of her keys. It was signed by 4 people, none of whom she had ever met, and it arrived 11 days after the Kestrel Harbor Community Foundation had announced a very generous gift toward the cemetery's maintenance endowment. She turned in the keys at the office window because she wasn't allowed past it. That evening, Elias found her standing outside the iron fence on the north side, hands in her pockets, looking through the bars at Section 12 where the light was going gold on the top of the grass. He came up beside her, and neither of them said anything for a while. "I can have this reversed in 30 minutes, he said finally. "Les, I know who sits on that board and I know what 2 of them owe." "No, Clara, no." She didn't look away from the fence. "You do that, and I stop being a person who got fired for doing the right thing, and I start being a person a rich man handed a job back to. That's not the same, and you know it isn't." She shook her head slowly. "My mother spent the last 2 years of her life being decided about. Insurance decided, hospitals decided, a woman on a phone in another state decided. I have watched what it does to somebody to be the subject of other people's decisions, and I am not doing it, not even from you." He was quiet a long time. Then he went home and he called the 4 members of the Board of Managers, one at a time, over the course of that night and the following morning, and he did not threaten any of them, and he did not mention money, and he did not raise his voice. He asked each of them the same single question. He asked how they intended to explain to more than 200 families, in a public courtroom that was now scheduled, that the last person in the city who could prove those families existed had been removed from her job 11 days after a gift landed in the endowment. Then he thanked them for their time and hung up. She was reinstated on Thursday with back pay and a 2-line letter that explained nothing. She drove straight to Fishtown and found him in the office at the end of the hall. "Did you do it?" "Yes." "How?" He told her. All of it, every call, the question he'd asked, the fact that he'd made a list first and gone in order. He didn't soften any of it, and he didn't ask her to be pleased. Clara stood there with her keys in her fist. "Next time," she said, "you ask me first. I'm not built for asking. Then get built for it. She put the keys in her pocket. Start now. It's a good day for it. The garage under the Fishtown building had 11 spaces and a low ceiling, and a light on the second row that had been buzzing since the summer, and Elias came down in the service elevator alone at 9:15 that night because he'd stopped letting anyone ride with him. He heard the car door before he saw it. Emmett Barone was already in the driver's seat of Elias's own car with his hands on the wheel, sitting there in the dark like a man waiting on a ferry, and when Elias came level with the passenger side, the locks went down all four at once with that flat, expensive thump. Elias didn't call out, and he didn't reach for his phone. He sat in the space between the concrete pillar and the door and waited, and after a moment the window came down. "Get in," Emmett said. "I can't get in, Emmett." Something crossed his cousin's face. "No," he said. "No, that's right." He opened his door and came around and put the transfer board across the way he'd done 100 times before, and he did it well, and neither of them said anything about that. And then Elias was in the passenger seat, and Emmett was back behind the wheel, and the doors were locked again, and the buzzing light made its noise above the roof. They sat. "I'm not going to insult you," Emmett said. "So don't ask me the question with a maybe in it. Ask me the real one. Did you give them the schedule?" "Yes." The word came out with nothing on it. "Every Thursday for a year and a half, you stopped at the same corner at the same time, and I was one of 4 people who knew it, and I'm the one who said it out loud." Elias looked straight ahead at the wall. "Why?" "Because the federal thing was coming and I could smell it. Because you were 3 years into turning the whole house legal, and you were doing it slow. And slow was going to get all of us indicted before it got any of us clean. They came to me and they said, 'We want the docks, we don't want a war. Pull him back from the water and everybody walks.'" Emmett's hands stayed on the wheel. "They said pull him back," that was the phrase. "I've said that phrase to myself maybe 40,000 times since. You thought they'd frighten me. I thought they'd stand him in front of you and let you look at him and you'd give up the pier leases and go home angry. That's what it was supposed to be." He finally turned his head. "I have never once said this out loud, so let me get it out. When they called me from Jefferson that night, I was in my kitchen with a plate in my hand, and I put the plate down, and I understood in about 1 second what I'd actually done, and then I got in the car and drove to the hospital and sat in that waiting room with your sister for 9 hours. Elias asked the only thing he'd wanted to ask for 18 months. "You came to see me more than 20 times. 26. You pushed me out to the courtyard. In February, you brought a blanket because I couldn't feel my legs and the nurse said I wouldn't know if I was cold." His voice didn't rise, and that was the worst of it. "How did you do that, Emmett? How does a man do that?" Emmett was quiet for a while. "Because I love you," he said. "That part was never fake, and you can spend the rest of your life deciding whether that makes it better or worse. I loved you. I just loved the chair a little bit more. The garage held that." Above them, somebody's footsteps crossed the lobby floor and faded. "All right," Emmett said, and reached into his coat, and put a flash drive on the console between them. "That's why I'm here." Elias didn't touch it. "This has nothing to do with your father," Emmett said. "Nothing to do with whatever's buried in that book of Warren's. This is the last 8 months. Kestrel's Community Foundation, the maintenance endowment at Holyrood, and the 2 intermediary accounts they ran it through. Board members, dates, amounts. 2 of those 4 people took money in their own names." He tapped the console once. "And the second folder is the permits office. There's a supervisor down there who's approved 4 expedited applications for Kestrel since the spring, and every one of them cleared in under a week. And his brother-in-law's consulting firm has invoiced Kestrel 11 times this year for work I cannot find any evidence of anybody performing." Elias looked at the drive. "Why are you giving me this?" "Because you'll need it in about a week and you don't know that yet." Emmett let out a breath. "And because I want something, and it isn't what you think. Say it. When this goes to the government, and it will, Warren is going to sit you down and tell you that a letter from the head of the family carries weight at sentencing. That you can write 2 paragraphs about cooperation and family circumstances, and it comes off the number. He'll be right. He'll advise you to do it." Emmett turned and looked at him fully for the first time. "Don't. Emmett. Don't write it. Don't call anybody. Don't let anybody in this family call anybody." His jaw worked once. You've been carrying me around for 18 months like a debt you didn't know you had, and I've been carrying you, and I'm tired, and there's only one way this stops being something we're both dragging." He put the car keys down next to the flash drive. "Don't give me a way out. Give me the sentence. That's the last thing you owe me, and it's the only thing I'm ever going to ask you for." Vaughn brought it to her himself, which he never did, and he set it on the corner of her desk with 2 fingers, the way a man sets down something he wants to be seen not carrying. "A gray folder, unmarked. Their whole case walks in on one witness," he said. "The caretaker. She's the one who kept the visitor's book. She's the one who'll authenticate it. And if she isn't credible, then that book is just a notebook a woman kept in a shed." He tapped the folder once. "She isn't credible. Read it before you decide what you think of me." Then he left, which was the smartest thing he'd done in a month. Margot read it that night. Clara Dunn had been a paramedic, not a bad one. Commendations, a training letter, the kind of file that gets a person promoted. And then, 3 years ago, an incident review following a call she'd responded to, and a psychological fitness evaluation ordered by the department, and a diagnosis, and a recommendation for graduated return. And then, 22 days after that, a voluntary surrender of certification, signed in a hand that had pressed hard enough to go through the page. Attached behind it was the run sheet from the call itself. Margot read that too, all of it, and when she got to the part that mattered, she stopped and read it again, and then she closed the folder and sat in her kitchen for a very long time. She understood immediately what she was holding. Not gossip, not a smear. A documented episode, in the record, under an evaluator's signature, that any competent attorney could stand up and read aloud in an open courtroom, and there would be nothing anyone could do about it because every word of it was true. Put that in front of Judge Ballinger, and the woman on the stand stops being the person who kept the names and becomes a person the court has to be careful with. The book gets read differently. 211 families get read differently. Margot drafted the email the next morning. She wrote it well, because she wrote everything well, and that was the part that would come back to her later at odd hours for the rest of her life. She did not write it cruelly. She wrote it as a memorandum to outside counsel regarding potential impeachment material relevant to the petitioner's authentication witness, and she attached the scan, and she read it over once and changed a single word to make it colder, and then the cursor was sitting on the send button and her finger was on the mouse. It stayed there. The apartment was quiet in the way it had been quiet for a while now. On the counter, next to the fruit bowl, was a white pharmacy box with a hospital label on it. The anticoagulants he'd left behind the last time he'd come for the rest of his things, and she'd been meaning to have them sent over, and she hadn't, and it had been sitting there long enough that she'd stopped seeing it. She saw it now, and what came up in her was not the box, and not his name, and not his face. It was a sound, that small mechanical click of the door locks going down, which had taken her about a quarter of a second, no more, one movement of a thumb, done before she'd finished deciding to do it. She looked at her hand on the mouse. It was the same hand, it was the exact same motion, one press, quick and quiet and easily explained afterward. She sat back from the desk like it had gotten hot, then she deleted the draft and emptied the deleted folder and sat for another 10 minutes, and then she got up and printed the entire file, every page, and put it in a manila envelope. She drove to Holyrood the following afternoon. Clara was at the shed, and she straightened up when she saw who it was, and she didn't ask any of the questions people would have asked. Margot held out the envelope. "What is this?" "It's your file," Margot said. "Your department file, your fitness evaluation, and the run sheet from the call. Vaughn gave it to me on Tuesday. I was going to send it to our attorneys, and they were going to put you on that stand and take you apart with it, and it would have worked." She kept her arm out. "Take it. That's the only copy that isn't in a server somewhere, and I'd rather it wasn't in a drawer where somebody else can find it." Clara took the envelope. She didn't open it. She didn't thank her. She stood there holding it against her leg and looked at the woman in front of her for a long moment, and then she asked the only question she had. "Did you read it?" Something in Margot's chest went still. "Yes," she said. "All of it? All of it." Clara nodded slowly. She looked down at the envelope, and then out toward the north path where the gravel ran down toward the gate, and then back. "Then you know who I am," she said. Margot opened her mouth. She didn't have anything to put in it. She stood there in a cemetery in South Philadelphia in the failing light, holding nothing, while the caretaker walked back into the shed and closed the door. The order came down at 4:50 on the afternoon before the hearing, 3 lines of it, and Warren read it twice on his phone standing in the hallway before he came in and said it out loud. The court would not accept a scan. For a document examiner to give an opinion on whether 2 sentences had been removed from a letter, the examiner needed the letter itself, the paper, the ink sitting on the fiber, the indentations of a pen that had pressed down 20 years ago. Bring the original by 9 in the morning or the argument doesn't get made. Where is it? Clara said. Downstairs, Warren said. Sublevel, north wall, the boxes from your father's office. It's been down there since we cleared out the Delaware Avenue place. They ate something out of paper containers in the conference room while the light went out of the windows, and at 11:20 the alarm went off. It was not the polite chirp of a smoke detector. It was the building alarm, the one wired to the suppression system, and it hit that low ceiling and came back at them from 4 directions at once. Elias was already moving toward the hall. Warren got to the panel first and stood reading it with his glasses pushed up. It isn't fire, he said. There's no fire. The head blew in the sublevel, and the pre-action valve dumped. He looked up. Everything down there is underwater, and the elevator's locked out. It's automatic. Alarm goes, elevator goes to the lobby and stays there. They came around the corner to the stairwell door, and Clara had it open before anyone told her to, and the sound came up out of it, that hard, continuous rush of water hitting a concrete floor from a height, and under it the smell of cold and dust and old paper going soft. Elias came to the top of the stairs and stopped. 19 steps. He'd counted them the first week he came back to this building, the way he'd counted every set of stairs in every place he owned, without ever telling anyone he was doing it. 19 down to a landing, then a turn, then 11 more. He sat there with his hands on the wheels and looked at them, and the water noise came up at him, and Warren said something about calling the fire company, and Clara said something back, and Elias didn't hear either of them, because everything in him had gone into one narrow point of white heat. He knew exactly which box. North wall, 3rd rack, 2nd shelf, the one with his father's handwriting on the end flap. He knew what order the folders were in inside it. He knew that if the water had come off the ceiling it would be filling from the top of the boxes down, which meant the upper shelf had minutes and the lower shelf had less, and he knew all of it perfectly and completely, and there was not one thing on this earth he could do with any of it. His hand came down flat on the wheel rim, hard, and the sound of it cracked off the stairwell walls. It isn't the walking. His voice came up out of him at full volume for the first time in 18 months, and Warren went absolutely still, because he had known this man since he was a boy and had never once heard it. That's what everybody thinks it is. It isn't. The worst part is knowing exactly what needs doing, exactly, to the inch, and having to stand at the top of a set of stairs and say it out loud to somebody else and hope they heard you right. The alarm cycled. The water kept coming. Clara didn't tell him it was all right. She didn't put a hand on his shoulder, and she didn't say any of the things people say, and afterward he would think that this was the moment he understood something about her that he hadn't had a word for yet. She took her phone out and pressed it into his hand and folded his fingers around it. "Video," she said. "Start it now and don't stop it. Every minute I'm down there, get it on that camera, because if anybody says later that we touched this before the examiner did, that's the only thing standing between us and losing the whole hearing." She was already pulling her arms out of her coat. "Tell me the box. North wall, 3rd rack from the door, 2nd shelf up, brown banker's box. The flap says Delaware Avenue in pencil. It's my father's hand, you'll know it. 3rd rack, 2nd shelf. Clara." She stopped on the first step. "If it's already under, leave it and come up." "That isn't what you want." "No," he said, "it isn't. But that's the instruction." She went down. He counted the steps by the sound. 19, and a turn, and the water noise swallowed the rest. The stairwell light was on the emergency circuit, and it made everything the color of a nickel. He held the phone out over the rail with the camera pointed down into it, and he did not move it, and he sat at the top of those stairs in the doorway with the alarm going, and could see nothing at all past the landing. That was the first 10 minutes. At 12 minutes the alarm stopped, cut off mid-tone, and in the silence that came after it he heard the water running and something else. Footsteps. Not below him, above. Somebody crossing the lobby floor, unhurried, and then the sound stopped over by the service corridor and did not start again. Warren heard it too. Neither of them said anything. Elias put his thumb over the phone's microphone hole without knowing why, and kept the camera steady, and down under all that concrete a woman he had known for 11 days was standing in water past her knees in the dark, running her hands along the ends of boxes she couldn't read, going by touch, third rack, second shelf, listening to the same footsteps come across the ceiling above her head and stop. She did not call up. She didn't move for a long time. When she finally did, she did it slowly, one hand out for the shelf edge, and she kept doing it, and it took her 34 minutes, and the whole time not one sound came up. Those 19 steps that a man sitting at the top of them could do anything about. She came up the stairs backward, dragging them one at a time, and by the end Warren was on the landing taking them from her, and Elias was at the top with the phone still recording, and there were 4 boxes, soaked through at the bottoms, the cardboard already going the texture of bread. They laid them out on the conference table on garbage bags and opened them under the good light. The letter was in the second one, 3 pages, dry, high enough on the stack that the water hadn't reached it, the paper stiff and cool and smelling of a closed room. Warren handled it with 2 hands like something living and slid it into a sleeve, and for a moment nobody spoke, because that was the hearing. That was the whole thing, sitting there on a plastic sheet at 1 a.m. It was in the 3rd box that Clara found the envelope. It had been filed behind everything else, unlabeled, and the pages inside it were not letters. They were carbons, material receiving tickets from a construction supply yard on the Delaware, dated across 4 days in the March of that year, the old 3-part kind where the yellow copy stayed with the supplier, and the pink went back to the site. Salvatore Barone's company had sold that yard its steel. The tickets were for scaffold anchors. Somebody had ordered a lot number, and somebody had rejected it on inspection, and then, on the 3rd ticket, a line had been drawn through the rejection and initialed, and beside it, in a young man's careful upright hand, an acceptance under expedited schedule, with a signature and a title, Site Engineer of Record, S. Vaughn. Nobody said anything for a while. Warren went and got the notebook and started writing. March, Clara said finally. March, the same week. Yes. Elias sat looking at the 3 pieces of paper. Say it out loud, he said. I want to hear somebody say it out loud. Warren said it. The scaffold on that job had come down in the 2nd week of March. 9 men had gone up in the morning and none of them had come home, and the inquiry had run for 11 months and concluded that an unforecast wind event had exceeded design load, and the families had been settled with, and the file had been closed, and the finding had been printed in the paper and forgotten by summer. It had never been hidden. That was the thing. The accident had been public, and the payout had been public, and anyone could still walk into a county office and read every word of it. What had been buried wasn't the collapse. It was the reason for the collapse, 1 line drawn through 1 rejection by a 21-year-old engineer 2 years out of school, who had been told the schedule could not slip, and who had signed what he was told to sign, and who had then been handed the incident report and told to sign that too, and had. In the 4th box, under a stack of tax records, was a small notebook with a rubber band around it. Salvatore Barone had never kept a diary in his life, and this wasn't one. It was a ledger of debts owed and favors called, most of the entries 3 words long. But in the back, on a page by itself, dated that spring, in that narrow forward hand, was 1 line. Bury them decent. Justice is for whoever comes after me, if he's braver than his father. Elias read it and put it down and looked at the wall for a while, and then he understood the rest of it, all at once, the way you understand the shape of a room when somebody finally turns on a light. His father had held those 3 tickets for 28 years and had never used them and had never destroyed them, and a man like Salvatore Barone did not leave a thing like that in a box in a basement where a nephew could stumble on it. Warren confirmed it in 2 phone calls the next morning, and it took Clara 10 minutes with the interment book to find the entry. In the summer following the collapse, the cemetery had approved a private improvement to the walkway along the eastern fence line at donor expense, a concrete apron poured beside the last row, and the donor's name had been left off the page. Under that concrete, beside the 9th marker, Salvatore Barone had put a sealed box, and in it 3 receiving tickets and whatever else he'd decided the future was entitled to. He'd told exactly one person in his life where it was, late, when he was dying and frightened and wanted somebody to carry it, and that person had been the young man he'd trusted most in the family. Emmett had been 20. Emmett had told Sterling Vaughn 18 years later, and that was why a development corporation with 22 acres of prime water and a rendering full of glass towers could not simply build around a small, awkward cemetery and pave a promenade past its fence. That was why it had to move, not the land. The ground beside the 9th marker, and no honest way on earth to dig at one grave without a court order for all of them. Warren was still writing when the building manager came in with a laptop and set it down and said he'd pulled the corridor cameras like they'd asked. And did they want to see it now or in the morning? They watched it at 2:30. Sub-level corridor, time-stamped, grainy in the green of a night lens. At 11:14, a door opened at the far end, the loading side, and 2 men came in wearing work jackets with nothing on them and went straight for the north wall racks, like men who had been given a shelf number. At 11:19, a 3rd figure entered the frame from the stairwell side, alone, and stopped. He stood there for 4 seconds looking at them down the length of that corridor. Then he turned and reached up and put his hand flat on the manual pull station on the wall and held it there a moment before he pulled it. The picture whited out as the strobes came on. The 2 men in the work jackets were moving before the water hit, and the last frames showed them going back out the loading door empty-handed. The 3rd figure did not run. He stood in the corridor with his arms at his sides and watched the ceiling open up over the north wall racks, over the shelves where the boxes were, over 8 months of bank records and account transfers and dated wire copies that he had spent a year assembling and that would have been the only mitigation any court would ever have given him. Then Emmett Barone walked out of frame and let the door close behind him, and he had not told a living soul, and he had never intended to. It was in the first box, the one nobody had bothered with because it held nothing to do with the letter. Warren had assembled it 18 months ago the way any competent attorney assembles a catastrophic injury file, which is to say he had subpoenaed everything, and everything included the emergency medical services report from that night on Passyunk Avenue. Elias had never read it. He had signed things about it and been billed for it and had it summarized to him by 2 doctors and a claims adjuster, and he had never once put his eyes on the page. He put them on it now, at 3 in the morning, because it was on top and his hands were already moving. Patient position on arrival, mechanism, initial assessment, and at the bottom of the first page, in the box for the responding crew, 2 names, and the first one was the paramedic of record, C. Dunn, NREMT P. He looked at it for a long time. He did not say anything, and Clara was across the table with a towel around her shoulders and wet hair, and she saw his face change, and she knew exactly which page he was holding before he turned it around. She sat down. Not fast. She sat down the way people sit down when their legs have made the decision for them. "Say it," she said. "I want you to say it first. You were there." "Yes, you were the first one there." "Yes." He set the page down very carefully, edges square, the way he'd set down his father's letter. Warren had gone out into the hall without being asked, and shut the door. "That isn't what I want to ask you," Elias said. "That's the one everybody would ask, and it isn't mine." He looked up. "You've known who I was since the first minute in the rain. I've watched you look at me for 11 days, and not once did you look surprised. And I told myself that was just how you are." His voice stayed low, which is how he sounded when it mattered. "Why did you let me sit there thinking a stranger found me?" Clara put both hands flat on the table. "Because you'd have thanked me," she said, "and I'd have had to take it." She breathed out. "You want the truth. Here it is, and it isn't the nice version. When my light came off the path and onto your face, I knew you in less than a second. And what I did after that, all of it, the counting, the coat, the way I got you tilted, every single thing I did on that gravel, I did because I owed it." Her jaw was going. "You keep thinking somebody kind came out of the dark and helped you. Nobody kind came out of the dark. A woman who'd been carrying a debt for 18 months came out of the dark and got to put some of it down. That's not the same, and I wasn't going to sit there and let you hand me a coat and call it grace." "What debt?" She didn't answer for a moment. "I was on scene in 4 minutes, she said. 4 minutes is good. 4 minutes is very good for that block at that hour." She looked at her hands. And then I looked at how you were lying, and I stopped. I didn't call it. I didn't reach for anything. I didn't move. My partner had to come around the truck and put his hand on my arm and move me out of the way and take over." She swallowed. 38 seconds, that's what the review says. 38 seconds where the person in charge of that scene did nothing at all. She said the next part fast, like getting through cold water. "You were lying the way they found my brother. Same side, same arm across." Danny was 20. He was bringing me dinner on a shift. That's all he was doing, and I heard it come over the radio and I didn't recognize the address until later, and that's the whole of it, and I'm not going to say any more about it than that. Elias didn't move. "Clara, Dr. Marsh told me." The cord injury happened the instant it happened. 38 seconds changed nothing. "I know what the doctors say. Then why are you still carrying it?" "Because knowing it and believing it aren't the same room," she said. "I've been standing outside that room for 3 years. Warren had the audio." Of course he had the audio. It had come with the file, the dispatch tape from that night. And when he mentioned it, Clara stood up and said no. She said no again the next morning on the phone. 4 days later, she drove to Fishtown by herself, without telling anyone she was coming, and asked Warren to put her in a room alone with it. He set the laptop on the desk and left. She listened to the sirens and the dispatcher and her own voice giving the scene report, and then the report stopped, and then there was nothing. That was the part everyone had marked in the transcript as silence. She listened to it with her eyes closed and her hands in her lap. And at about the 9th second of it, under the rain and the idling engine, so faint that 3 reviewers and 2 attorneys had run past it without hearing anything at all, there was a voice. Her own, almost nothing. "Danny, it's me. I'm here." She played it 4 times. She had not known she'd said it. She had believed for 3 years that she had frozen out of fear, that some coward part of her had looked at a dying man and refused, and she had built her whole life since around the shape of that belief, had handed back her certification and taken a job cutting grass over her own family because of it. And it wasn't fear. For 38 seconds, on a wet street in South Philadelphia, a woman had looked down and thought that this time she had gotten there in time, and her body had simply stopped in the middle of the miracle. Elias was in the doorway when she opened her eyes. He didn't ask what she'd heard. He reached over and closed the laptop, and then he put his hand out, palm up, and left it there. And Clara Dunn, who had knelt in the mud for a stranger and gone down 19 steps into black water and never once asked anyone for anything, took hold of it and put her forehead down on the back of his hand, and finally, for the first time since a Tuesday 3 years ago, let somebody else hold still while she came apart. He had it in his hand, and everyone in that office knew what it was worth. 3 receiving tickets with a young man's signature on them, and a phone list. And by Friday afternoon, Elias had worked out exactly how it would go, not the courtroom. The tickets would go to 2 members of Kestrel's board, and to the underwriter carrying the bridge loan, quietly, over a weekend, and by Monday Sterling Vaughn would resign for personal reasons, and the petition would be withdrawn by a company trying to save itself, and it would be finished before Judge Ballinger ever gavelled anything. Clean. Total. Nobody would ever have to hear the word scaffold said out loud in a public room. He was explaining the sequence to Warren when Clara came in with the visitor's books under her arm and stood in the doorway listening, and when he finished, she set the books down on the chair and said, "And then what happens to them? Then it's over." "That's not what I asked." She came to the edge of the desk. 211 families got a letter saying they couldn't be found. Anna Petrosky is 86, and she brings a folding chair, and she signs her name with a pen on a string, and somebody in an office wrote unable to locate next to her, and she doesn't know it yet. Her voice didn't rise. The only place that ever gets said out loud is a courtroom on Tuesday with a stenographer in it. That's the one room in this city where it goes on the record forever. Elias started to speak and she kept going. "And those 9 men have been lying in the weeds under numbers for 28 years. And this is the first time in 28 years anybody has been in a position to make the city listen to why. You'd be trading that for a resignation letter." She picked the books back up. "This stopped being about your family a while ago. Are you going to take their hearing too?" He sat in the dark of that office for most of the night, with the tickets in a sleeve in front of him. It was not the same thing as the night he'd recused himself. That night he'd given up power, which is a thing a man can do in 90 seconds if he decides to, and he had decided to, and it had cost him less than he'd let on. This was giving up the other thing. This was the part of him that had been sitting in a chair for 18 months waiting for one clean private moment to put its hand on somebody's throat, and he had earned that moment, and he had it, and he sat with it until the windows went gray. At 6 in the morning he called Warren and told him to file nothing and send nothing. Vaughn didn't wait for Tuesday. At 5:15 on Saturday morning, a flatbed came down the alley off the service entrance at Holyrood, with 2 track-mounted rigs on it and a crew of 4, and the foreman had a folder with a geotechnical investigation permit in it, issued by the city, stamped and dated and entirely valid, authorizing 4 exploratory borings for subsurface characterization ahead of a development application. Clara met them at the gate in her coat with the keys in her hand and asked to see the location plan. She read it standing in the road with the truck idling beside her. 3 of the 4 bore locations were out along the western fence in open ground. The 4th was in the eastern corner. She knew that corner in her sleep, knew the fence line and the rough grass and the row of 9 flat markers, and she knew the concrete apron beside the last one, and the point on that plan sat directly on it. "This isn't a soil test," she said. "The foreman said he just went where the plan said." She went into the shed and opened the visitors' books. She started at the front, at the oldest one, and she called every number in the margins, some of them written in her own hand over 3 years, some in the hand of the man who'd had the job before her. She said the same thing each time. "My name is Clara Dunn. I'm the caretaker at Holyrood. There's a drill rig at the east fence this morning, and I don't think it's a soil test." She called for 2 hours. Some of the numbers were dead. Some of the people had moved to Jersey or Delaware County or Florida. Some of them called 4 other people. By 7, the cars had started coming down the alley and parking on both sides of it, and by 8 there was nowhere left to park and people were walking in from Passyunk. They came in raincoats and church coats and work jackets. They came with umbrellas because the sky had that look. They filled the path into Section 12, and then they filled the grass on both sides of it, and then they stood in the rows themselves between the stones, careful about where they put their feet, and they turned and faced the fence line, and they stopped. That was all they did. Nobody chanted, nobody carried a sign, nobody so much as touched the machinery. More than 200 people stood in a cemetery on a Saturday morning in complete silence, and the only sound in the whole place was rain starting on umbrella fabric. Anna Petrosky set her folding chair down in front of her husband's stone, and sat, and folded her hands in her lap, and looked at the drill rig the way you look at weather. Elias came in through the service gate at 8:30. He could have gone up the path. The path was open and every person standing in it would have moved, and would have moved gladly, and he knew that, and he stopped at the back instead, at the end of the last row, behind all of them, where nobody could see him unless they turned around. He stayed there. He didn't say a word to anyone the entire morning. The foreman had been on the phone with his office twice. Now he climbed down off the rig and walked up toward the fence line to look at the ground he'd been sent to open, and he stood there a while in the rain looking at a row of 9 numbered markers with the grass grown over their edges, and then he looked at the stone beside where he was standing, the last one in the row before the numbers started, and he read the name on it. He was quiet for a moment, then he took his phone out, and he turned his back to the crowd, and he had a short conversation nobody could hear, and at the end of it he put the phone in his pocket and stood there with the rain coming off the brim of his hard hat. Then he walked back and said something to the driver, and the driver leaned out and said something back, and the foreman said it again. The engine turned over, the flatbed backed slowly up the alley, all the way out, and turned onto the street, and was gone. Nobody cheered. 200 people stood in the wet grass and watched it go, and then they began, without anyone telling them to walk over to the rows and see the people they had come for. Courtroom 6 of the Orphans' Court had 11 rows and no gallery to speak of, and by 10 minutes to 9 on Tuesday there were people standing along the back wall and out into the corridor, and a woman in the second row had brought a folding chair and been politely told she couldn't use it, and had held it on her lap for the entire proceeding. Judge Ruth Ballinger came in, and the room stood and she looked out at it for a moment longer than she needed to before she started. She dealt with the housekeeping first. "Before argument," she said, "the court will note a disclosure. The controlling trustee of the Barone Family Trust, which holds the easement across the subject parcels, notified this court in writing 11 days ago that his fiancée is a certifying officer for the petitioner. He recused himself from all decisions touching this matter on the same day, before any party had raised the conflict and before this court had ruled on anything. She held up a small hardbound notebook in an evidence sleeve. Counsel for the trust has also submitted a contemporaneous log, in his own hand, of every contact, question, and instruction from that date forward. I've read it. It's the first time in 19 years on this bench that a party has handed me his own rope before I asked for it. Sterling Vaughn leaned toward his attorney and said something, and then he said it to the room, because he'd lost the ability to tell the difference. Who is the trustee? Ballinger looked past him at the front row on the left, where the first seat had been removed and the space left open. He's just arrived, she said. The door at the back opened. He came up the center aisle and turned into that empty space at the front and set the brake and folded his hands, and he did not look at anyone, and Sterling Vaughn spent the next several seconds discovering something about a man he had eaten dinner across from in an empty restaurant. The evidence came in 3 layers. The examiner testified first, and they put the 2 versions of the letter side by side on the screen, 3 pages and 1 page, and then overlaid them, and the 2 deleted sentences came up in red in the middle of a paragraph that had closed over them like water. Then the metadata. The file had been opened, altered, and saved from an executive account at Kestrel Harbor at 10:36 at night, and the account required biometric authentication, and Kestrel's own counsel confirmed on the record, quietly, that the credential belonged to the chief executive. Second layer, the consents. 211 records struck from the count as unable to locate, laid beside 5 cloth-bound visitors' books from a shed at Holyrood, and the examiner walked the court through name after name after name, and when he got to Petrosky, the woman in the second row put her hand over her mouth and the judge waited for her without saying anything. Third layer was Clara. She went up in a coat she'd owned for 6 years and answered every question in short sentences, and at the end her attorney asked her to identify 2 documents, and she held them up, 1 in each hand, and read the signatures at the bottom out loud. Maeve Dunn. Daniel Dunn. My mother has been gone 4 years, she said. My brother has been gone 3. Somebody signed their names to permission slips and somebody filed them in this building, and I want to know which of those people ever thought about the fact that they were writing on behalf of people who couldn't object. Then Ballinger turned to the certifying officer. Ms. Ashford, before you executed the certification of the consent schedule, did you verify it? Under the table, out of sight, Vaughn's hand closed around her wrist. It was not hard. It was the pressure of a man reminding a colleague of an agreement, and Margot Ashford looked down at the table in front of her and felt 4 years arrange themselves into a single line. No, she said. She pulled her arm free and lifted a leather case onto the table and opened it. The original 3-page letter from her own files. The approval log with the 51 seconds on it. The source table she had never opened. And a message, time-stamped, from her chief executive, instructing her to obtain a confirmation from Elias Barone stating that the altered letter reflected the family's present intentions. She entered all of it. Vaughn's attorney was on his feet, and Vaughn was talking over him, saying that the court was watching a compromised woman panic in public, that the man in the front row had gotten to her, that none of this was evidence, it was a marriage. Margot waited until he ran out. Panic didn't certify that schedule, she said. Ambition did. Mine. I'd like that in the record in those words. It took the rest of the morning. Ballinger suspended the petition, referred the altered filing and the consent forgeries to the United States Attorney and to the State Attorney General, barred Kestrel from any contact with the Cemetery Board pending review, and ordered the surrender of the geotechnical permit. Vaughn was walked out by his own counsel with a court officer trailing, and as they came up the aisle he stopped level with the open space at the front row. He looked down at Elias for a moment. I was 21 years old, he said. They handed me the ticket and said sign it, and I signed it, and then they handed me the report and said sign that too. 21. His mouth moved into something that wasn't a smile. And you're sitting there judging me out of a trust your father built with exactly the same silence. Elias said nothing. He didn't have anything to say, because there wasn't anything, because it was true, and both of them knew it was true, and it would be true for the rest of both their lives. On Thursday, under an order signed by Ballinger and in the presence of a court-appointed monitor, a licensed contractor cut and removed a section of the concrete walkway apron along the eastern fence line at Holyrood. Nothing was disturbed beyond the pavement. No grave was opened, no marker moved, and the order said so in 3 separate places. 11 inches down, set in the base course, they found a galvanized box with a bolted lid, and it took a man with a wrench 4 minutes to get it open. Inside, in a plastic sleeve, 3 carbon receiving tickets from a March 28, years gone, and beneath them, wrapped in oilcloth, a bronze plaque about the size of a serving tray, laid face down against the earth. 2 men lifted it out and turned it over on the grass, and the rain had stopped, and the light came across it, and there were 9 names cut into it, one under another, in a plain, deep letter. Elias read them, and then he read the 10th line, at the bottom, set slightly apart from the others. Rosa Barone. Warren found the rest of it in an afternoon, because once you know a name, the paper stops hiding. Rosa Barone had taken those 3 receiving tickets to a lawyer's office on Chestnut Street in the May after the collapse, without telling her husband she was going, and the lawyer had told her what lawyers tell people, that it would be long and it would be ugly, and she should be certain. She had said she was certain. On the way home, she'd become unwell and gone into the emergency department at the old Northeast Hospital, and she had sat in that waiting room with her purse in her lap while the desk worked through the ones with the better coverage first, and she had waited a long time, hours of it, and by the time anyone called her name it was too late for what was happening inside her. She did not live to the morning. Salvatore Barone buried his wife, and then he went and made an arrangement with the construction company, and the arrangement was silence, and what he took in exchange was not money. He took the promise that nobody would ever come near his son or his daughter, and he kept his end of it for the rest of his life, and he put the only copy of the truth in a metal box under a walkway beside 9 men he had paid to bury decently. Elias learned all of this at 34 years old in a courtroom, having believed since he was a boy that his mother had simply fallen ill and died the way people do. Ballinger's ruling came down the following week. The relocation petition was denied with prejudice. The altered filing and the forged consents went to the United States Attorney. Kestrel's board suspended Sterling Vaughn during the lunch recess of the hearing itself, without waiting for the afternoon. Emmett Barone pled to what he had done, and no letter went to the court from anybody named Barone, and he received the sentence he had asked for in a parked car in a garage with a buzzing light overhead. Kestrel Harbor did not collapse. The design went back to the architects and came out again 6 months later, built around the cemetery instead of over it, with the eastern fence line turned into a green edge and a walking path that ran alongside the rows rather than through them, and several hundred people kept their jobs, which mattered to several hundred families who had never once been mentioned in any headline about any of it. When the room emptied that first day, Elias was the first one to the door, and he stopped there and held it, and let the woman with the folding chair go out ahead of him. Margot caught him in the corridor. She looked like someone who had already decided to say the thing and was only waiting for her mouth to catch up. 3 days before it happened, she said, Emmett came to me. He said there was talk. He said if I could get you to step back from the port leases, all of it would go away. She held her hands still at her sides. I didn't tell you. I thought about it for about an hour and then I didn't, because if you stepped back from the water you stopped being who you were, and I had started to notice what that would mean for me. Her voice stayed level, and that was somehow worse. I bet on it being talk. I lost. She looked at him. I didn't leave you at that gate, Elias. I left you 18 months before that. All I did in the rain was do it with my hand. He listened to every word of it. He waited to feel the thing he'd been carrying for a year and a half come up, and it didn't come, and what came instead was very quiet. That night you told me to call someone who cares, he said. I did. Somebody came. He didn't say it to wound her, and it wounded her anyway, and then he thanked her for telling him the truth when nothing forced her to, and he closed the door between them so gently that she stood there for a moment, not sure it had closed. She got all the way out to the street and around the corner before she started crying, and she did not go back, and she carried it herself, which was the first honest thing she had done in 4 years that nobody was going to reward her for. The week before Emmett went in, Elias went to see him. There was no reconciliation, and neither of them tried for one. I didn't write the letter, Elias said. I know. I'm not going to. I know. Elias put his hands on the wheels. "I'll visit," he said. Emmett nodded once and turned around, and that was the whole of it. The Lantern Fund was announced in the spring, run by an independent board on which Elias held no seat. It set stones for every grave in the city carrying a number instead of a name. It covered burials for families who couldn't cover them. It paved the paths at Holyrood flat and level, and put a call station at the gate where a man had once sat 40 yards inside it in the rain. And it funded retraining and counseling for emergency responders who had walked away from the work carrying something they couldn't put down. Clara was the first person to receive it. It took her 7 weeks and a great many sessions in a quiet office to fill out the application, and she nearly didn't, twice. A year later, she was working 3 nights a week on a truck out of the same station, and keeping the cemetery the other 4 days, and still paying her mother's hospital account every month, which never did get forgiven and never was supposed to be. Elias was still in the chair. The surgeries had done what they could do a long time ago, and somewhere in that year he stopped thinking of it as a thing waiting to be fixed. The 9 new stones were dedicated on a bright Saturday morning in Section 12, and the families came, grandchildren walking in with their grandparents, small hands putting flowers down on grass while somebody read the names out loud in the sunshine. Elias and Clara were married at City Hall on a Tuesday morning, with 9 people present and no photographer, and the front row had 2 seats left empty, and nobody had to explain to anybody why. They drove back to Holyrood afterward. The 9 stones stood in a row with full names on them now, and beside them a small bronze marker that did not carry the word Baronne anywhere on it. Here lie men who built this city and did not live to see it finished. No one is buried here without a name. Clara crouched down in front of the chair, level with his eyes, the way she had that first night on the wet gravel. "Where does it hurt?" she asked. "Nowhere," he said. "First time in all these months." And that is where this one ends, with 2 people in a cemetery on a Tuesday afternoon, and 9 names that finally exist. If there is anything worth taking away from it, maybe it is this. Dignity was never about whether a man could stand up. It was about whether the people around him could still see a person sitting there. And care, real care, was never the scarce thing anybody makes it out to be. There was a woman with a flashlight, a lawyer with a notebook, 200 neighbors standing quietly in the rain, and a foreman who read a name on a stone and did the right thing when nobody was making him. Elias Barone had been asking for it from the wrong person. That was all. If this story moved you tonight, please take a second to like it and share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to our channel so you can hear a new story with us every day. We would truly love to know what you felt while listening, so tell us in the comments, honestly and from the heart, because we read them and they mean a great deal to us. Wishing every one of you good health, peace, and quiet joy in your days. Thank you for staying with us to the end. Goodbye for now, and we will see you in the next video.